one of the most difficult things about looking back on my time as an atheist is that it's really exhausting trying to be this kind of moral arbiter of yourself, like coming up with your own moral framework, determining what's good and what's bad, and then constantly having to reevaluate that. As a Christian, you turn to God for that. You turn to Jesus for that. Jesus, lays out for us, his two commandments, which is to love and fear God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
Hi, I'm Jana Harmon from the eX-skeptic podcast. Have you walked away from Christianity, or you're questioning whether or not it was even true to begin with? Maybe you're asking if truth even exists, or if it's arrogant to say that one faith is right. These questions are more common than you might think. We've talked with over 120 former skeptics and atheists who've shared similar doubts and questions. That's why we've created 9 themed playlists on YouTube, drawn from personal stories of former skeptics who've wrestled with these same issues, among others. Go to eX-skeptic on YouTube and find our playlist, Is It Possible to Believe Again? Or What About Other Religions? Among others. Once you've found them, you might want to share these themed playlists with others who might have their own unique questions about faith. Hello, and welcome to eX-skeptic, the podcast where we explore unlikely stories of belief, the unexpected journeys of those who once resisted belief in God, but who found themselves transformed by the very faith they once dismissed. I'm your host, Jana Harmon. In today's episode, we meet Allison Leonhardt, a former atheist who once was convinced that belief in God was outdated and unnecessary, and she sought meaning through politics, philosophy, and music. But beneath the surface was a restlessness, a longing for something more grounded, more lasting, more true. How did her years of skepticism begin to unravel? What caused her to shift her view of God and Jesus from something that didn't matter at all to now being the most important thing in her life? Whether you're skeptical, curious, or quietly searching, I invite you to listen in, because sometimes it's not a dramatic moment, but a series of small, quiet ones that lead to the most extraordinary change. Well, hi, Allison. Welcome to eX-skeptic. It's so great to have you with me today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very excited to join you.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you're located, the kind of work that you do, maybe a little bit about your education.
So I'm from beautiful Calgary, Alberta. It's located just north of Montana. So just north of the United States. It's a wonderful city. We're close to the Rocky Mountains, close to Banff, Alberta. And I like to spend most of my weekends when I can out hiking in the beautiful Rocky Mountains. I grew up here, but I moved away for most of my 20s. I studied public relations at university through the University of Victoria, and I did online school before it was cool. I did my program at a distance so I could work full-time as well. So my work is in public relations and communications. And I've tried to focus on working for organizations that help people. So I spent several years working for the St. Albert Public Library before moving over to England and working in management in the finance department with the National Hospital System over there, or the National Health System over in Manchester, England. Before coming back to Canada and working in the housing sector, working with organizations that provide affordable housing, and now also a little bit of market-based housing as well. And it's been a real blessing to get to work in that industry, and to get to work on an issue that's so important in Canada right now.
Yes, it's obvious to me that you do have a very other-centered, people-centered view, that you really have a very altruistic, very large heart, that you're using your gifts and skills for humanity. That's very, very admirable. But we're here today to talk about your story, your individual story. And you said that you grew up in Canada, I presume in Calgary. Why don't you give us an idea of what life was like growing up in Canada and in your own family, and whether or not religion or God was any part of your family life?
So growing up, I went to Catholic school. My dad's a non-practicing Catholic, and my mom is non-practicing United. And so she wanted us to have a religious education, but there wasn't a lot of context behind it growing up. So I never knew the Lord growing up or really understood religion. It was just another subject that we had at school, and never really felt a connection with God or Jesus growing up. I think a lot of that came from too. It's just, my parents weren't particularly healthy people. They didn't have very healthy relationships with their children. And so at the age of 17, I had actually made the decision to leave home and go move in with friends and to get away from that. So I think though, it was around that time that I had decided that I was an atheist. And I think a lot of that came from an anger at God. I don't think I saw how there could be a God after what had kind of happened in my childhood. So,
How did you perceive God, or what were your perceptions of God and religion, and why did you reject Him or God or belief?
that's a fantastic question. I think it changed. I'd say as a teenager, I just don't think I understood it. I don't think I understood how there could be a God, the point of God, the value of God. I used to be I was quite rebellious too. So I used to show up to religion class in high school with my copy of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, and I'd sit in the front of the classroom and read it. So I think I really held to like a scientific kind of worldview, thinking that well, the earth is this many years old, and I just didn't see a place for God in that. And then I think as I got older, into my 20s, like, I cared about helping people since I was a teenager. I think a big thing for me is, I saw the hurt and brokenness in my life, and I wanted it to end there. I didn't want other people to struggle with things that I'd struggled with. And so I believed very strongly in helping people, but I also knew you needed a moral framework. And so I used to read a lot of books on different types of like political philosophy and books on philosophy, and things that, almost try to be the Bible, but aren't. I liked, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So in my 20s, I understood the need for, objective moral truth, but I don't think I actually kind of knew where to look. And so I turned to what I think a lot of other people turn to, which is politics.
You were in a place in your life where you were recognizing that you wanted to help humanity, and that was a very good thing, but you didn't have a moral grounding or framework for it. Now, you're telling me also that you had been reading Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion and in other places where he read there is no such good thing as good or evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference if you're an atheist. So you're having these seeming tensions about wanting to do something good and calling it good and feeling like it's good, but yet you have a worldview that didn't seem to support it. So I'm wondering, as an atheist, did you feel comfortable with this place that naturalism gives you, that Richard Dawkins was proclaiming, that there is no such thing as good and evil, yet you had rejected God because he didn't seem to be good?
That's a fantastic question. I didn't have a logically consistent answer to that, in terms of things being objectively good or objectively bad. And I also don't think terms like that would have entered my language. I focused a lot on, in terms of defining what was right and wrong based on kind of what was modern, by modern standards, considered to be acceptable. And also my own moral framework, which might not have always been consistent. That was one thing I really struggled with. I moved over to England for 2.5 years when I was in my late 20s. And I found that I could justify, lying to myself, lying to others, because I could rationalize it. And I knew what I was doing that was wrong. I knew, say, lying was wrong. And I understood my reasons for it. So I'd say, oh, this is okay. But I also knew that that was wrong. And I think I spent a lot of time in that gray area, but I also don't think I was comfortable in it. It produced a lot of anxiety. I remember having a lot of sleepless nights. Even a big change I've noticed, in my life since becoming a Christian is that, I used to be really afraid of dying. It was just, one of those things that would creep into my mind every so often. and fill me with dread and fear. And it's not something that I worry about or even frequently think about now.
Were there other issues besides death that were disconcerting to you, and the fact that you weren't able to maybe ground these concepts of good and evil? What else did life look like as an atheist? Was it fairly satisfying, or were there other issues that gave you pause? Maybe atheism isn't exactly what I thought it would be.
Felt a lot more underlying like anxiety than I do now. Just a lot of worry about a lot of things, even worry about like, what do people think about me? Because in that worldview, the moment matters a lot more than it does when you have Jesus. Because if you believe that this life is all you have, what's happening in this moment is of a lot of importance, because it's, this is the only moment that you have. So I think, I tried to find a lot of grounding in, music. I used to DJ. I was involved in the music scene. I dated a guy who was in a band. My weekends were filled with, going out to see bands play. And I think I found a lot of like meaning in the moment, in, having those kind of short-term experiences with friends, where you're, at a concert and stuff. And it's not that, music isn't good and important still. I think, there's a lot of value in, creating beautiful things, and especially beautiful things for God. But I think sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect when you place your identity in that. And so for me in my 20s, I placed my identity in, I was into a lot of 60s British music, so in the mod subculture and in the punk subculture. And I found my identity in those things. And I think that's where there's more of a problem.
Why is there more of a problem?
Because you're not placing your identity in Christ, but most of all, you're placing your identity in something that's temporary. It's not something that offers a moral framework. It's also not something that matters that much. I mean, for someone that was into, going to concerts and stuff, when you're putting your value in, I got this vintage dress and I look great in it, and I got a lot of likes on Instagram. That's not a very good way of quantifying your value or worth. I think as humans, we're worth a lot more than that.
You're right. And I think obviously it is hard to place your identity in something so fleeting, right? And so you were working in England, which is a beautiful place, fascinating place, and you were living what you thought your best life is to find meaning and purpose, value. Did you have a community of those who were fairly like-minded as atheists who had a similar worldview, or did you ever have any Christians in your world growing up, or even in England, that intersected your life in any point that gave you a picture of something different than what you were living and believing?
That's a great question. When I lived in Canada, I didn't know any Christians. And even when I came back to Canada, as a Christian, I didn't know who to reach out to, because it just wasn't something that existed in my world. In the music scene, in the left-wing political scene, there just wasn't any overlap. In England, my friends were mostly people similar to me. And, I wouldn't say that it was interesting. I moved there and I felt like my kind of atheism softened. My friends there, I'd say they were more agnostic. They just, if you asked them, they didn't know, and they didn't really have an opinion on God or Jesus. Whereas I'd say in Canada, because we have a lot more kind of Christian education in Alberta, our second largest school system is the Catholic school system. So I think a lot more people get introduced to the concept of God. They might not get to know Jesus, but they get introduced to the concept. Whereas in England, the school system is a lot more secularized. And so for a country that had, such a great Christian history at one point, I think a lot of that is unfortunately being lost. But my friends that I met over there were pretty similar to me. We would go see bands play on weekends, go over to each other's houses for drinks, go on trips. And that was kind of what our world revolved around. I was a little bit different because I did a little bit of volunteering with the Labour Party over there. So I liked politics. And that's where I think I really looked for a lot of kind of my grounding and value.
I wonder, as someone who was an atheist at the time, what was your perception of what the Bible was, what religion is or was, what Christianity is or was? What were your thoughts about how you perceived those peoples and institutions and ways of thinking?
I think not just like the new atheism movement, but some of the things that kind of came out in the mid 2000s really damaged kind of my potential faith at the time. And the Da Vinci Code was really big when I was in junior high and high school. Um, and so I didn't believe that the Bible was accurate. I thought it was a book, but I thought that it had been written by humans, and I didn't actually really know what it said. So I didn't see it as something that could be accurate, but I saw, humans as being so valuable that the Bible as well would be. And so I never really engaged with it. And even though, yeah, I never read it. And I didn't engage with it. Yeah.
So it was easy to just dismiss based upon the idea that it was some kind of man-made document that was corrupted over time by biased men. Or and Dan Brown has an interesting take, but through the Da Vinci Code. But so I can see where it would be easy to get a distorted view of what the Bible is. But anyway, so religion at that time, I would imagine, would have taken a bit of a Dawkins view that religion is not good.
Yeah, I think I just saw it as outdated. I think I saw that we'd moved past it. And I mean, it's such a sad thing to think about now. But I didn't see a value in it. I didn't see a value in God, in the objectivity of in right and wrong, in the community it brings, in the salvation that Jesus brings. It didn't click with me. And I think too, like, I'd watched movies like Spotlight as well too. And so I saw a lot of the like corruptions and abuse that had happened, particularly in the Catholic Church. And I just thought, what does this offer? But as well too, I didn't even engage with like historical Christian figures. Someone I'm a huge fan of now and read a lot about is William Wilberforce, and just the role that him and his Christian faith played in abolishing the slave trade, and how incredible that is. But figures like that aren't taught about in our schools, which is such a shame, because I feel like we're missing such an important part of Western history.
So you had rejected Christianity as a belief system, the Bible corrupted, and so you were living in this world in England, and you had some anxiety, a little bit of issue with trying to figure out how to ground, your strong impulses of morality. Walk us on from there. Talk to us about what happened in your life. What made you stop and think, well, maybe there is something to this, to Christianity, to Jesus, to the Bible, all of that. What caused you to move in a different direction?
So it was interesting when I first moved there because, I had wanted to move to England my entire life since I was a child. And I loved British music, British culture, British history, the countryside. And so I had thought that by moving there, I would solve my problems. I thought, I wouldn't be worried about death anymore. I wouldn't be worried about all these things. I thought I would fit in a lot better. And I just thought it would answer a lot of my problems and challenges. And it was interesting because I got there and I described to the friends that I made, I was like, I feel like I've climbed a mountain only for there to be more mountains around me. Like I've climbed a mountain and now I'm in a valley. And I was so confused because I thought that was going to fix everything. And I felt so alone and empty. That was a period of about 2 years though, where I just felt like that, where I was so confused. When that really started to shift, so I had made a friend at work who he was a Christian, wasn't practicing very much at the time, like went to church sometimes. I knew he was a Christian, but I didn't know too much about it. What happened was during the start of COVID, the lockdown got announced in England, and my housemate at the time took off, like just took off. I got home one day and everything was fine and normal. I'd go out to the grocery store. I was all excited. I found a grocery store that still had food because people were like raiding stores there. It was pretty crazy. And in the 20 minutes I was out, like he was like, I'm done. I can't do this. And like fled back to his parents' house. So I was really panicked and concerned because here I was in a foreign country working for the hospital system, not front lines, but still I had to go into the hospital every day in a foreign country, not able to go back home. Canada had mostly closed the borders and facing the prospect of spending the pandemic by myself. I was really scared. So my friend, he actually reached out to me and he said, hey, you know what, like this lockdown, it's only supposed to be 3 weeks. And why don't you come stay on my couch for that time, and we can kind of ride this out together. And so he had a place in the English countryside in the Peak District, just outside Manchester. And so I went one day after work to go stay with him because the rules were quite weird. So we basically went. He was like, "Kate, come over now before the lockdown gets announced, and then it's not like breaking quarantine rules." So I go to stay with him, and then one of the first nights I'm at his place, he says to me that he had wanted to start going back to church, but he couldn't because of the lockdowns, and so he was thinking about watching Zoom church. And so I thought, well, I'll be a good house guest. Like, I was like, I can watch church with you on Sundays. And so that first Sunday came around and we watched a Zoom church service from his living room. And I was really surprised because it wasn't what I thought it would be. And so I was like, that was actually kind of nice. And so the Sundays go by,
What did you think it would be? What were you anticipating a church service to look like?
I think I was maybe anticipating like what it was like growing up in Catholic school, where you're sitting cross-legged in a row in the gymnasium, watching a lot of kind of lectures that you can't quite really hear, and you're not really sure how this relates to you, and you're kind of thinking about anything but that. I guess I expected it to be a lot more kind of institutionalized, and not as personal. And so, and one of the things that even first struck me too is the music was really nice. I know now that they sing a lot of Phil Wickham songs, and I was like, like the worship songs are really nice. This message, like this is really nice. And I don't even remember what the first few sermons I'd heard were on. Just that, I was like, I was very surprised. I was enjoying it. And so my friend said to me after a couple weeks, he was like, well, you're really enjoying this. Because we talk about the sermons afterwards as well too. He said, you're really enjoying this. Why don't you try reading the Bible? And so I downloaded a Bible app on my phone and I started reading the Bible on my way to work in the mornings. We had an 1.5-hour train commute each way, so I had a fair bit of time. But yeah, so, and there was one morning where I was reading Matthew 6 from the Sermon on the Mount, where when Jesus says to not be anxious. And when I read that, it was like Jesus was speaking to me. I never knew that Jesus could say something that spoke to me, that related to me. And that just really struck me. It spoke to exactly what I was feeling in that moment, what I was experiencing during COVID and what I'd gone through in my life. And so from that, my friend suggested, hey, you should try an Alpha course. So I did an Alpha course, and that was really good for learning some of the fundamentals of Christianity. And, after that, there's not like a moment where I was like, I became a Christian. I just know that there was a point where I started praying. I started putting my trust in Jesus. It was a really difficult time too, though, because so my right to work in England was going to be expiring. I was on a youth mobility visa. And so I started applying for jobs just around the world. I had really wanted to stay in England, so I was applying for jobs there that might sponsor me. I applied for a visa to go to Sweden. And then eventually I started applying for jobs in Canada. The whole time I kept praying. I said, God, send me somewhere where I can get to know you. And I just kept praying that. I'd moved up to Edmonton for a good chunk of my 20s, and I didn't want to go back there. I didn't want to go back to my old friends and my old way of life. And so I wanted to go somewhere new. And what was really, remarkable at that time, I'd applied for hundreds of jobs all around the world, visas to go to other countries. And in those 6 months, I got one job offer. And I had one day applied for a job in Calgary. I was just looking at postings. I'm like, well, I guess I should look at Calgary. And it's the city where I'm from. So I applied for this job. And immediately afterwards, I like slammed the laptop in disgust. I'm like, I'm not moving back there. That's where my family's from. Like, nope, I'm not going to Calgary. And sure enough, in those 6 months, that was the one job offer I got. And at the time, I had this very exasperated prayer. I was like, Lord, why? Like, I knew I had to go, but I was like, God, really, why? Why Calgary? So getting back here wasn't exactly easy. There was a travel ban on, so I had to wait for the travel ban to lift to be able to come back to Calgary. But I went with that, got back into the country. And from there, I was like, okay, like I need to get to know Jesus. I need to get to know other Christians. And so I had asked around for some church recommendations from my church in England. They had connected me with someone, I think up in Edmonton, who'd recommended a couple churches in Calgary. And so I decided to try Center Street Church, which is a big evangelical church here in Calgary. And a lot of my reasoning for that was, I was like, well, I was so wrong about what the Bible was. So maybe I'm wrong about what evangelicalism is as well. So I went and tried that. And it's been a real blessing. I've been at that church for a couple of years now. I got baptized there in June of 2021. So just before I turned 30. And yeah, I've just been able to grow a lot in Christ, to get to know other Christians.
Well, that's wonderful. I do want to step back for a moment, Allison, because I'm sure there's some listeners thinking, okay, wow, she was a atheist who really believed, all that Richard Dawkins was telling her at one point, and that she believed for scientific reasons, and, that God wasn't good. And then all of a sudden she's in COVID, which lockdown, I'm sure that's very discombobulating. It's very disconcerting in many ways. So I know that a lot of people were rethinking a lot about their lives, about what's true, about reality, because that kind of large, sobering event will do that. So you find yourself with a Christian who's inviting you to church, essentially, and it's something different than you thought it would. And you were open at that point to start reading the Bible. And then the next thing you know, you're telling me, okay, and then Jesus. And I'm sure some listeners are going, whoa, hey, wait, just a minute. It was a very bright young lady, and she had justified reasons for not believing. But when you started reading the Bible, and sometimes it is just as simple as that. When you encounter Jesus, like you did, you had almost an encounter with Jesus in the scripture, that he was speaking to you and to your life. How did you know that what you were accepting at that moment, it wasn't just that it felt good or sounded good, but that it was true, that it was worthy of belief? And in Christianity, you are not only having to believe it, in a sense, you're actually giving your life to this person, Jesus, who says that he can, give me your anxiety. But it's not only give me your anxiety, it's give me your life. So did you have any, or did you wrestle with any intellectual aspects of, wow, sounds too good to be true? Is it?
I think there were two big things that kind of changed my view of the Bible. So one of them had been in Manchester, England, at the John Rylands Library. They have the oldest known fragment of the Gospel of John. And I had gone to the John Rylands Library one day before COVID just to see it. And I had seen, I saw the fragment of the Gospel of John, and it's quite small. It's, it's maybe the size of like, a couple quarters, or, it's maybe an inch or two. It's very tiny. There's not very many characters on it. And I've got a few other fragments as well there that they put on display. And, when I saw it, I had seen it as an atheist and hadn't thought too much of it, but do remember being quite fascinated that what I'd read on the display was that they had said that the text had been so consistent that this little fragment of papyrus that was with just a handful of characters, they could match it as being from the Gospel of John. And, it was too small to have a full phrase or anything on it. But it had just enough that they could tell it was from that. And this fragment, I don't know exactly how old it is. I think it's from only a couple of years after John had wrote his gospel. And that really struck me to think that it's not changed. It's, humans haven't edited it and put things into it and changed the details enough that it's actually stayed consistent enough from when it was first written to how we read it now, that you could identify that. That really struck me.
So that countered a bit of the Dan Brown thesis that you had believed that the script had been changed or corrected over time by biased men. So I know that fragment was convincing in some way, that it was early and consistent and reliable. But there's a lot more to textual reliability than seeing a fragment, right? And so
another thing that really challenged me on it as well was, and I believe it's in the Alpha course, one of the things that they talk about is the reliability of different historical texts. So you look at something like Homer is the Iliad, and we only have something like 2 ancient copies of it. Like, we don't have that many, but we attribute it to Homer when we generally consider what we're reading in the Iliad to be faithful to how it was written all those years ago. And so then they talked about just how many copies we have of the various Gospels and the various texts in the Bible. And that really challenged me to think that we have so many copies to know it wasn't, changed in the Middle Ages or anything like that. Like, we have enough, ancient texts that this book is reliable and these texts are reliable.
Yes, for anybody who's willing to look into that, we have what Dan Wallace would call an embarrassment of riches, that we have so many copies of the text that we can find what actually was close to the original by 99.95%, 99.5%, close to the originals, even though we don't have the original documents themselves. And that's a very different narrative than when people say, oh, it's just a man-made document. That it's not, it's like the telephone game, and it's been translated over time and over the years. But you, as a former, I guess, librarian, or you worked in that environment, you understand the integrity of texts, and that you had studied somewhat to understand that the reliability of the biblical text, so that when you were reading these things about Jesus, it didn't, it struck you as true, not just because Jesus said them, but actually there's documented evidence to show that there really is some substantive reasons to believe that it is true. And so I guess that gave you more confidence that what you were reading actually, and for the fact that it actually intersected with your life so personally. I think there's something when people read what the words of Christ, read about the person of Christ, it's so different than they have in their minds of who they think he is, or what he might have said, or what even the Bible is, that they might think it's just a book of rules or something, but it's something much different. So I presume that you read more than just Matthew, and that you really read the text a little bit more broadly, and to get the whole story. And I'm just curious, the person of Christ, who did you think Jesus was before you started reading the Bible? And then who did you come to find he was through reading and understanding who he was and what he claimed to be and what he said?
Really knew who he was. I think I just thought that he was a man who lived at that time and had done some interesting things. But I don't think I believed anything else. I know now that Jesus is the Son of God. He died and he rose again. And like, I think even, things apologetically that helped me a lot with my faith in that and in coming to know Jesus in that is, one thing that struck me really early on is they talked in the Alpha course about other historical sources at the time, talking about something strange was happening in Israel at that time. And so actually one of the books on the shelf behind me is Josephus. He was a Jewish historian at the time who had no vested interest in Jesus, was not a Messianic Jew. And he writes in his books about, a man rising from the dead, and, strange things happening at that time, which I thought was really interesting, and that you have, these sources that have nothing to gain from it, no vested interest, also reporting that something had happened. I also draw a lot to, I appreciate in Chuck Colson talks about this in his writings a lot, in how, in his experience with the Watergate case, you had all these guys that couldn't keep their story straight for a week, and they had a material interest in it. Whereas with Jesus, you have all of these people who have no, material interest in it. They're not getting rich from being Christians. They're not getting fancy jobs or cars or anything like that, but are willing to die to say that Jesus is Lord, that he died and rose again. And that really says something, and that their stories all, line up and are the same. That really said something to me as well. So, yeah, I'd say that's where a lot of it comes from.
So the pieces came together for you, and you found the Bible to be worthy of belief, Jesus to be worthy of belief enough for you to give your life to him. Now, you've spoken about your life a little bit since. Through your journeying as an atheist, you spoke of issues with anxiety with regard to your life or the possibility of death, with regard to you're trying to find meaning and an identity that was worthwhile, that would be lasting. But some of those things seem to elude you as an atheist. How would you say that your life as a Christian had satisfied or met some of those, I would say, deep human longings?
I have a lot less anxiety now. That's changed substantially. I'm not afraid of death anymore either. I mean, I obviously don't seek it out, but I'm not worried about it in the ways that I used to be. I have a lot more confidence, but I also have a lot more humility. I'm a lot more grounded in knowing what's right and what's wrong, and also even knowing what I'm responsible for. I think one of the most difficult things about looking back on my time as an atheist is that it's really exhausting trying to be this kind of moral arbiter of yourself, like coming up with your own moral framework, determining what's good and what's bad, and then constantly having to reevaluate that. As a Christian, you turn to God for that. You turn to Jesus for that. Jesus, lays out for us, his two commandments, which is to love and fear God, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that takes an awful lot of pressure off. Those can be hard to stick to. They can definitely be a challenge sometimes. It's incredibly, incredibly grounding. And so that just helps a tremendous amount. It provides a lot more direction in your life. My life is different now. And I'm just so thankful for it every day.
It sounds like the Alpha course also played an important part in your journey. For those who aren't familiar with it, can you talk about what the Alpha course is?
So it's a course that introduces you to the kind of basic kind of questions about Christianity. It's really accessible, and it's a lot of, it's a safe space to ask questions about Jesus, about God, to talk to other Christians, to find out what they believe, and to also learn a little bit about, what's prayer and all of that. I found for me it was really helpful in kind of answering some questions I'd had and some misconceptions I'd had about Christianity. And it was also just a chance to kind of get to know some other Christians as well too. Early on, someone in that had recommended to me C.S. Lewis's book Mere Christianity, which I'd recommend anyone that's curious about Christianity or is new in their walk as a Christian to read that book. It's helped me massively a big part that's really kind of helped me from it as well is C.S. Lewis says in it that, when you first read the Bible, if there's something you come across that you don't understand, leave it and come back to it. There's certain fundamental things, but there's a lot of stuff, especially in the Old Testament, that can be tough to understand. And so that's something that's really helped me as well in my faith, knowing that, like, I'm not going to understand everything in the Bible right away, and that's okay. But the overall story of it is worth more than whatever questions I might have about one part of it. So that's been extremely valuable. Another thing that really helped me as well, too, is he gives an example of a lady who might be a little bit difficult to deal with, and you're asking, like, why is this person a Christian? Like, they seem quite unpleasant. But he talks about how the work of the Holy Spirit, it changes your character, and so this person might actually be less difficult than they were before. And it's funny, but like, that helps me have grace with other Christians, knowing that someone might have some habits that I find a little bit difficult or something like that, but it's to know that the work that the Holy Spirit does in their life, like, it takes time. As you're a Christian, like, it takes time for behaviors to change, for opinions to change, and just for the Holy Spirit to work in our hearts. It's you don't wake up one day and everything's different. It takes time.
Would you say that has your worldview influenced the way that you see and move in the world in terms of policy and politic and the kind of work that you're doing now? Or do you think that it informs more and grounds more the work that you're doing, even in public policy and in housing and in hospitals and all of those things?
I think a big way my faith has changed my worldview is it's caused me to be maybe a more open reader, to kind of consider things a little bit differently. A big experience I had in England was starting to read different books. I had always considered myself very well read, and I realized I had engaged with a lot of books on the left side of the spectrum, looking for kind of values and meaning there, and I hadn't really engaged with anything on the right. And I'd found that maybe on the right that there were a few more ideas about how to help people and how to order society a lot better. I think a big way my faith has changed my approach to public policy is trying to have a more kind of grounded, hands-up approach, or hand-up approach to things rather than a handout approach to things. I think a big difference between the left and right is sometimes when programs are focused more on a handout and more on relief. While that's important, it can sometimes be a bit more temporary. And now I tend to appreciate programs that are more focused on a hand-up. So things that are more, that help a person develop a sense of agency, that helps them grow their skills and helps them better their circumstance and their life and the lives of people around them. And so that's definitely something that I've tried to approach in my work in the affordable housing sector. That's been a big thing, and even as well in the political engagement as well that I do now.
Yeah, and no, that makes sense. It is a bit of a biblical ethic, and I'm sure some people wrestle with what that means in terms of helping the poor and the oppressed and the weak. But there is something valuable about agency and responsibility and really valuing the self and others and enabling them to do things for themselves. Even so, I can see where with a worldview shift, that your ideas and the way that you enact those ideas might change as well. And before we turn the page to advice, is there anything else about your story that you think we might have missed, or that you want to bring forward that we haven't, or anything?
I don't know. It's just it's hard to articulate just how wonderful it is to get to know Jesus. To have someone that you can pray to ask for help and guidance, for the grounding that brings, but also to know that he's coming back, that he's coming again, that this isn't it. That just offers so much peace and comfort and joy. It's, I find as well too, dealing with stressful situations and all of that, which certainly there can be a lot of in politics, is knowing that, what we're dealing with now, this is only temporary, and God's got a plan in it. That's a big thing that brings me a lot of reassurances. I just dealt with a very big loss with a campaign that I worked on, and it was really, really sad. But my friend whose campaign I ran, he's a Christian. I'm a Christian as well, and we both know that God has a plan in it. That as much as we tried our best, God's got his hand on it. He's got something else planned, and that's okay. And we just have to be humble and faithful and follow his lead.
Well, I'm sure not only in your position, you've seen a lot of unfortunate social situations. You've seen a lot of brokenness in the world, and in some part you rejected God because of the brokenness that you had experienced in your own life. Now sitting there as a Christian, how do you reconcile the goodness of God with either what you've experienced or what you observe even now?
So I think about, in my own situation, God's been able to bring a lot of healing into some of that brokenness. So, mentioning at the start, not having a great childhood, I didn't have a relationship with my father for a long time, for about 10 years. And one of the first things that kind of changed in that is I felt this nudge that I should reach out to my dad and see where he's at. And so in the fall of 2020, I actually reached out to my dad when we started speaking over email while I was in England. And, I have a relationship with my father. I see him every few months. We talk on the phone pretty regularly. And, I'm so grateful that the Lord has brought healing into that. And, while it can be tough that I've dealt with a lot of hurt and brokenness, I'm grateful for the healing that the Lord has brought in that. And I think as well, too, it helps me be compassionate towards others as well. So working in the housing industry, I met a lot of people who've had backgrounds similar to mine that, maybe don't have the most healthy coping mechanisms. And that helps me have, compassion and understanding for where they're coming from, but also spurs me on to want to help them and help them, find the healing that I found as well.
That's beautiful. That is truly a story of redemption, isn't it? Taking the past, recognizing it for what it is, but finding healing through Christ. It is an extraordinary thing that one can find in life in Jesus, because we're all broken and we've all been susceptible to the harm from others. But yet we find a place in Christ that is a place of healing, a place of unconditional love and hope that even all things can be restored to a place of healing at some point. So, and he's also someone who has suffered as we have. So he's one who understands our suffering. So it sounds like you have received a lot of healing through your faith, and that is wonderful to see. Allison, there are probably a lot of people out there who are listening to your story who have been hurt by brokenness in their own lives, who've read Richard Dawkins and been unconvinced intellectually that religion is bad and that you don't need to be, submit yourself to belief in the wishful thinking of religion, that you can be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, all of those things, but yet they may, in some sense, also struggle, and that the life as an atheist may not be all that they thought it would be or should be. And they're looking at you as someone whose life has been transformed, as someone who used to call themselves an atheist, but now you're sitting here as a Jesus follower, as a Christian. And it sounds like that your faith has informed all of your life. And they think that's, they look at you and wonder how perhaps they could take a step in that direction. So if someone was interested in becoming a Christian, what would you encourage them to do, if to figure out whether or not Christianity is true or God is real? Should they read Mere Christianity? You recommended C.S. Lewis. What would be a good step for a skeptic to take a step forward?
I highly recommend two books. So the first one being Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I think it's a phenomenal foundational book, and I'd highly recommend they read that. It's also really accessible and easy to get through. And then the second book I'd recommend would be The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. He started off as a skeptical journalist investigating Christianity. And he lays out a lot of stories about just the authenticity of the Bible and of Jesus and kind of proves it. And so he's a really great resource as well. So his book, The Case for Christ, I'd highly recommend.
Yeah, those are great resources, both by former atheists. C.S. Lewis, a former atheist as well. As a Christian, do you have any advice for us as Christians on how to help engage others with the possibility of reconsidering Christianity as something other than they thought it would be? I know you had that wonderful friend during COVID that helped introduce you.
Really open when someone has questions, and not being shy about sharing your faith. I think that's really important. But I think also too, there's a challenge to us as Christians to learn more, to be able to engage with some of those questions that our friends might have. So knowing the basics of our faith, knowing a bit about church history, I think as well helps a lot. And so just being able to articulate answers to friends, and then also having a good, consistent, open dialogue. So if someone does ask you a question and you don't really answer, being like, what, that's a great question. How about you come over for dinner next week and let's talk about it? And I think actually that plays another big part too, or leads into another big thing we can do as well, is just to practice hospitality. So, being the hands and feet of Jesus. So finding opportunities to help those around us, inviting people into our homes and having them over for dinner, having barbecues. A big thing I like doing too is, I'll have barbecues, I'll go for group hikes and stuff. And, my friends are a mix of Christians and non-Christians. And I think that's great for my non-Christian friends to get to make more Christian friends than just me. I think it's really important. And so just creating those spaces for people to get to know people and get to know Christians.
Yes, I think that's huge, isn't it? Especially in a day where people feel so isolated, honestly. It's amazing what a little bit of community and conversation and coffee with a friend will do to open the door to some really meaningful interaction, questions, discussion, just trust among friends, and creating a safe place to even have those conversations. You and I met at the Colson Center for a Christian Worldview, and even there, it was amplified that hospitality comes with a house key. Yeah, that we need to be very invitational with our lives so that others can come and see and know and find what we've found. Allison, you are a beautiful ambassador, like I said before, of Christ. And so I'm amazed that you have only been a Christian for 5 years, because you're sitting there with such maturity and grace and a way of communicating about your faith that's really so wise and so mature and so admirable. Thank you so much for coming on to tell your story, and for just encouraging us to live out loud our faith and to invite others in and to be informed. I think that's incredibly important as well. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's been fantastic to chat with you and just, to get to talk about how wonderful Jesus is. And, thank you as well to all the listeners. And for anyone who's questioning, I understand, I've been there before. Thank you for listening. And I hope as well that you'll give Mere Christianity a read.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Allison's story reminds us that the journey from skepticism to belief is often deeply personal. It's not just about intellectual evidence, although that matters. It's about encountering a person, Jesus Christ, who speaks to our fears, our questions, and our deepest longings. If Allison's journey resonates with you and you're curious to explore more, we encourage you to check out the Alpha Course, one of the key resources that helped her rethink Christianity. Allison also recommended 2 powerful books by former skeptics, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. You'll find links to those as well as her recommended resources in the show notes. Want more stories like Allison's? Visit our website at eX-skeptic.org or our YouTube, where you can explore our playlist by topic. You can also sign up for our email list to stay connected and be the first to know about new episodes and resources. If you'd like to reach out and talk to one of our former guests with your own questions, email us at info@exskeptic.org. We'd be honored to connect you. Ashley Kelper is our wonderful podcast producer, and we're part of the C.S. Lewis Institute Podcast Network. Thank you for joining us. If today's episode stirred something in you, share it with a friend, leave a review, and come back next time for another unlikely story of belief.